Okay, now I want to take another crack at this idea of different white wine making strategies. I think of this as the 4 points of the compass. The point being, if you want to go east, don't mix that with going west, or you'll just never get anywhere. And these really are 4 different directions that you can take, and they're sort of mutually exclusive. So, getting back to Bruce's idea of coherent crush choices, there are some illegal combinations. For example, if you want to make a Sauvignon Blanc in the Method 1 reductive style, then you're making a wine which has no shelf life, and everybody knows it. And so that wine's got to come leaping out of the bottle with great aromatics and a lot of freshness. And so it would be insane to stir lees to mix in a Method 3 strategy, which will suppress the aromas when you're in the selling window, and the wine never comes around until no one will buy it. And I'll bring up some other examples as we go along here. But this just sort of occurred to me as a way to slice things, and I invented these 4 different ways to make white wine. It's an article in your syllabus right there on pages 552 and 3. So Method 1, these are sort of in reverse chronological order. So Method 4 is the most ancient, Method 1 is the most modern. So Method 1 is the totally reductive style where we want to shade the fruit, amp up the thiols. The poster child for this type of winemaking is the New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And we're going to protect the wine completely from oxygen at every stage. Method 2, I've already talked about. This is using oxygen, lots of oxygen, at the juice stage prior to SO2 addition, in order to brown out polyphenols and thereby protect the fruity terpenes in those aromatic varieties like Riesling and Gewürztraminer and Muscat and so forth. Method 3 is sort of the opposite of Method 2 in that here we want all the polyphenols we can get. We want to have some tannin. And what we're going to do, that wine's going to be harsh when it's young. And so we're going to stir lees so that they coat the tannins and sort of put pajamas on them. And what we end up with wine that has good body and complexity, but usually has to age for a pretty long while before it opens up aromatically because it has a lot of reductive strength. I don't want you to confuse reductive strength, which the synonym would be antioxidative power. That's not what we mean. When we talk about being totally reductive in Method 1, we're talking about keeping away oxygen. That doesn't mean that the wine has a lot of reductive strength, and in fact, it probably doesn't, because those wines have terrible shelf life. Method 4 is the most ancient. We know it's been practiced for at least 8,000 years. It may have been invented in Georgia or Macedonia or Armenia. It's basically putting a clay jar in the ground and crushing white grapes and then combining everything, including the skins, stems, and seeds, and doing a long maceration, classically 6 months, and sealing the whole thing up. The legend has it that you would make the wine the year your son is born and then open up the clay jar or qvevri on his wedding day when he's 13. Anyway, the Georgians taught the Phoenicians, taught the Greeks, taught the Romans, taught the Portuguese how to make wines in this way, and it's the way wines were made until quite recently. So let's take a deeper dive into all of these styles. Method 1, we want to shade the fruit because we're trying to preserve these thiols. These are sulfur compounds. One of my favorites is formicaptopentanone, which has an aroma sort of like grapefruit or passion fruit. And when it gets at a high concentration, then it smells like kitty litter or cat piss. Same compound, it just kind of flips around when there's a lot of it. Actually, one of the nicest things you can say to your New Zealand winemaking friend is, gee, I sure got a lot of cat piss aromatics out of your Sauvignon Blanc. She'll be delighted. Because they're never going to see any oxygen, they have to be very low in tannin. And they do undergo cold skin contacts to get more flavor out of the grapes. And because there's no oxygen, they're always green juice club, always add SO2. And then we're just going to blanket the fruit and the press with inert gas and do a very gentle vacuum pressing, because other than fining, we have no way to take tannin out of these grapes. So whole cluster pressing is sometimes employed so that we keep that tannin really low. Here's an example of an anaerobic crushing station where you can see there's just dry ice everywhere and the whole thing is covered. And this is a press made by Cyprum. It's just got a giant blimp full of inert gas, CO2 or nitrogen. It's recycled. It deflates to fill up the press, and then as the juice comes in, the inert gas goes back up into the blimp and is recycled many times as we run multiple press cycles. Now, the virtue of these wines is their freshness. They come screaming out of the bottle with really beautiful, fresh aromatics. The downside, and everybody knows it, is that when you make wines this way, they don't age at all. So no one will buy a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc that's more than 2 years old because they know that will have lost its freshness and started to fall apart. Method 2, this is generally done with aromatic varieties, by which I mean Riesling or Gewürztraminer or Muscat. Ricatatelli in Georgia is another one. And the idea here is we're going to try to protect the terpenes from oxidation. So the linalool and geraniol are the most common ones. Linalool is the smell of Muscat, geraniol is in Riesling, and they can be oxidized by hydrogen peroxide that is thrown off as part of phenolic oxidation and turned into something called TDN, which is the smell of petroleum. So first of all, to optimize the terpenes, we're going to open the canopy and get lots of sun, hopefully cool sunlight on that fruit. The Finger Lakes are a wonderful place to do this because they have longer days than in California by about 2 hours and thinner air above the vineyards because they're up about 1,000 feet. And then down in Lower Lake Seneca, there's reflection off of the lake. The lake is very broad there. And so if you're on the eastern slopes of Lower Lake Seneca, you get very, very fruity, rich, tropical aromas because of all of those three things happening together. Those bodies of water also protect those Vitis vinifera, tender, not winter hardy vines from winter kill because they moderate the temperature in the winter. Now, because this fruit is so delicious, all these aromatic varieties have evolved to have a lot of tannin in the skins. And the reason is that they get attacked by birds and bees, and they want to be able to cauterize those wounds. But as I said, the tannin, when it oxidatively polymerizes, it kicks off hydrogen peroxide, which attacks the fruitiness of the terpenes and oxidizes them to this petroleum aroma. So what we're going to do, and I've talked about this before, is before we add SO2, we're going to do flotation and hyperoxygenation to lower the solids and oxidize all the polyphenols while the terpenes are still bound to sugars and they can't be attacked. And those glucosidic bonds only get cleaved during the action of fermentation. So then after fermentation, we're going to protect these method 2 wines the same way we protect method 1 wines with inert gas and generally stainless steel, and early bottling. The difference here is that these types of wines, Mosels in Germany being an example, can age 30 years. So this is a whole different idea than method 1. Method 3 is a much older method that's been around for several hundred years. So here we're going to use the tannin, and to soften it, we're going to do extensive lees bâtonnage. We're going to stir those lees pretty regularly until the tannins go from being harsh to being sort of plump. Now that's going to bring a lot of reductive strength to the wine, and it's going to have to age for a good long while before it opens up aromatically. And so it's useful to grow these types of wines on soils that impart minerality, whatever that is. But we know that we get it, and I'm not talking about the smell of wet stone. I'm talking about something in the finish that we always get on limestone or decomposed granite or slate, which is what you have in the Mosel, or schist, which is what you have in Portugal and the Douro. And we can also get minerality on any soil if we promote the healthy earthworm population, kind of knock it off with the pesticides and herbicides, get a healthy earthworm population going, and then that will foster the growth of hypogeous fungi, which exchange apparently minerals in the soil for sugar, so they have a symbiotic relationship with the plant. Now, I like to make this type of wine out of Chardonnay off my vineyard at Napa Valley College, and you have to get the fruit ripe, which means in California, because our air is too dry, that by the time the fruit has yellowed up, it's going to make a wine that's approaching 15% alcohol. And so that's why I invented this process of reverse osmosis to pull the alcohol down into the 12s somewhere. Then, as I said, these wines need extensive bottle age. My 2005 Faux Chablis Chardonnay and my 2005 Sur-Lie Chenin Blanc are both just coming into their own. So another trick that's often implied with these types of wines is to add in a little bit of an aromatic. I use Viognier in the Chenin Blanc so that it has something going for it aromatically in its teenage years. So these wines are generally done in barrel, and we'll have the lees settle down, and we'll come in and stir those lees once or twice a week. And then finally, we've got the Method 4 wines, which involve prolonged skin contact and are erroneously referred to as orange wines. I don't mind the term amber wines. The Georgians really hate the term orange wine because people think the wine is made out of oranges. And besides, it's not orange. There are actually 150 words in Georgian for the different colors of these amber wines. The second thing is, even though, yes, they're amber, they are not oxidized. They just have a lot of tannin, similar to the degree of tannin that you would get in a red wine, but they can have really interesting aromatic complexity. And so I like to think of them more as alcoholic aromatic tea. And, tea is not oxidized. It's just brown because it has a lot of phenolics in it. And these wines are the same way. I would have to say that they're an acquired taste. When I first came across them 10 years ago, I wasn't all that crazy about them, but now I am. They're highly versatile food wines. In fact, you'll have a supra, which is a 27-course dinner that your friend invites you over to his house. You and 80 of his closest friends. And they have this party, and they'll only serve one wine with those 27 courses. Probably something the guy made in the ground in his garage. They benefit from extensive bottle age. You can drink them when they're young. Sort of like red wines. They definitely improve and soften and can even gain freshness in the bottle. And so often they're aged for decades. So here's some pictures I took in Georgia. Here's in the top here, you can see that's a typical Ricacatelli color for these wines. These are Ricacatelli grapes here. They have a little bit of a blush on them. Here's some that aren't quite as ripe. This they call a Quevri, and it's spelled Qvevri. And that's something that's buried in the ground that you ferment in. And so here's lots of examples of that. This is what a Georgian winery looks like. And here's a guy inside of a Qvevri cleaning it out. Now this is an amphora. Again, the Italians have got it all wrong. They call their clay jar fermentation vessels amphorae. But an amphora is a bottle. You can call these Qvevris or clay jars, whatever you like. And here's an example of skin contact. You're going to ferment on the skins and then seal up. You can see in this case, they've got these glass covers, and they just leave the wine there for 6 months or so. And then back in the old days, they would remove it with a gourd on a stick. You see one here, it's upside down here. That's the way they rack. It's very, very tedious. You know, this was before anybody had invented pumps. So that's what method 4 looks like. And it's really becoming fashionable to play around with these kinds of wines. And I certainly recommend that you do so, at least on a small scale, because they're just a lot of fun. Coming up next, and this is an Australian term, feral ferments. We're going to talk about the whole idea of terroir and uninoculated fermentations, which are sometimes called spontaneous fermentations. And there are a lot of fanciful myths that just aren't true concerning this practice. And so we'll go all over that in our next session.